Welcome to Living a Richer Life by Design with host Jonathan Kruger, and I'm your contributing host, Mark Ralphs. Join us as we dive into a variety of subjects including fulfilling relationships, vibrant health, community engagement, social impact, and of course, the stewardship of your finances.
Welcome to Living a Richer Life by Design. This is Jonathan Kruger and co-host Mark Ralphs. On today's show, we'll be talking to Susan Schoenfeld, founder of Wealth Legacy Advisors, LLC. She's an award-winning thought leader to families of wealth and a public speaker to the financial services industry who serve them on the human issues that keep families of wealth up at night. Legacy, governance, stewardship, succession, philanthropy, and managing fiduciary risk are the topics that she discusses. And Susan is based in New York City. She's a recovering attorney and CPA with deep experience as an advisor to families and family offices on the human issues of wealth. So before we get started, Susan, thank you for joining us on the show. And could you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Jonathan and Mark. It's my pleasure to be here. As you mentioned, I describe myself as a recovering trust and estates lawyer and CPA. After I left the active practice of law, I worked for 14 years as fiduciary counsel at a white shoe trust company here in New York City, catering to ultra high net worth families, where I created, developed, and facilitated a series of women in wealth workshops designed to explore the personal issues of wealth. Issues like, how do I raise my family in an atmosphere of wealth and still have them turn out to be productive members of society? And issues like, how do I protect my family's hard-earned wealth from the bum who's going to marry my child and might become a creditor of my family one day? Ultimately, that led me to leave the trust company and first work with a $600 million single-family office as their family ambassador. And then in 2013, I launched my consulting firm, Wealth Legacy Advisors, also based here in New York City where I live, where I serve as thought partner to families and family offices and their trusted advisors on what I like to call the issues that keep people up at night. Issues of governance, legacy, stewardship, next generation, and philanthropy. Even though I'm still a member of the bar, I don't practice law or give any legal advice. Even though I'm a CPA, I don't give any accounting or tax advice. I give no investment advice, and I sell no product. What I provide is strictly, as I said, thought partnership to families of wealth on the human issues of wealth that matter most to them. In addition, I'm a keynote speaker to financial services firms about these issues of legacy and stewardship.
So you give some advice, it sounds like, but when it comes to discussing family wealth, as you've just said, you've devoted yourself to taking a look at the soft issues. So you've already talked about some of those, or at least you've alluded to them, but so what are some of the typical hard issues that are almost always addressed? And then what are some of the key soft issues that you're referring to?
Well, thanks so much for asking, because so often it is an overlooked topic. Generally, in the financial services world, whether it's a wealth management firm or an RIA or some other investment allocation or investment advisory world, the so-called hard issues are the things like investments, asset allocation, taxes, and things like that that can be quantified, compared against other periods, and measured against an index. But by contrast, the so-called soft issues of wealth are not as measurable. They're the human issues, the fundamental attitudes or mindsets that people have, and they consist of the less tangible aspects that are much more subjective and less easily measured or charted than the hard issues. But very often, these are the issues that do keep people up at night, and particularly families of wealth whose basic needs are met and are really not as concerned about the taxes, although of course they're nervous if they got a letter from the IRS, and they're not as concerned about their investments, although of course in the market volatility that we're having lately, everyone's concerned about that. But what they're really worried about are the issues of how do I raise my children in an atmosphere of wealth and have them grow up to be grounded, productive, contributing members of society, and those are the soft issues.
So when you speak about some of the biggest challenges of raising the next generation of wealth, you include things like financial literacy, preparing for family business succession, protecting them from financial predators, etc. You indicate, though, that there's likely one more important element that these need to include. And can you tell us what that is? And I think you just did, actually.
Well, sure. I have asked the question, what do you think is the biggest challenge of raising the next generation of wealth hundreds of times all over the country? And while the choices of teaching them financial literacy or preparing for family business succession or even protecting them from financial predators and creditors all get some hands raised, what do you think is the number one most frequent answer to this question? It is raising productive members of society is far and away the most frequent response. And why do you think that it is? Well, about 20 years ago, I was invited into a new business meeting with a lovely couple, let's call them Mary and George. And George had spent many years creating and building an invention, let's call it a widget, and had just sold it and realized a huge liquidity event. And all the while that George was working on his invention, Mary was raising the children, running the household, paying the bills, hiring and firing service providers, doing the investing, doing the taxes, everything that was necessary to free up George to build his business. And Mary and George had decided to interview my former firm to manage their newly liquid portfolio and serve as their multifamily office. And they were brought into this ornate wood-paneled conference room for the pitch meeting, and the new business development guy was there and invited one person from each department to make a pitch. And I sat there watching all the folks from the investment department, the tax, the new business, the relationship management departments direct their remarks to George, and I noticed that Mary looked completely unengaged because nobody was paying her any attention. So when my turn finally came, I looked directly at Mary and asked her only one question. I looked at Mary and said, "Tell me, Mary, what keeps you up at night?" Because I knew that she was the one doing the investing, the taxes, managing all the service providers, etc., and I expected her to talk about those challenges. But instead, what she said surprised me and forever changed my viewpoint on how to approach clients and prospects. She told me that she was interested in all those things they're talking to my husband about, the investments and the taxes and all that. But that's not what keeps me up at night. What really keeps me up at night are my children. I have 2 teenage sons. We live in a small town, and everyone in our town knows that we suddenly became very wealthy. And my 2 teenage sons are suddenly the most popular kids in school. And I'm new to this wealth too, and I would appreciate guidance on how to educate them on handling this newfound popularity. And I'm scared to death that they're going to lose the incentive to make something of themselves one day, aside from the family money. And when I was listening to her, I realized that she had shared an important truth with me. And I kept engaging her in the conversation, and then she was telling me more about her sons and their interests and sharing her hopes and fears for their future. And so I came to realize that that's the secret to what families of wealth care most about. It's how to raise their families in an atmosphere of wealth and still have them grow up to be productive, contributing members of society and not the proverbial trust fund babies.
And Susan, when addressing the next generation about families' wealth, what are some of the important questions that parents should be asking themselves first in regards to how they raise their children to make them or to be able to influence their lives and allow them to be able to grow to their fullest potential?
Great question, Jonathan. The 2 questions I hear the absolute most from wealthy families are, how much do I give my kids and when? And how much do I tell them about the wealth and when? Or put another way, how old should my child be before they have access to significant sums of money? And the corollary to that, of course, is how do I prevent entitlement? My favorite quote on the topic is from the so-called Oracle of Omaha, Warren Buffett, who said that he wants his children to have enough that they can do anything, but not so much that they can do nothing. And that's certainly one approach to answering the question. You know, the knock on millennials these days is that they're not prepared to roll their sleeves up and put in the hard work. They live in a world where Facebook went from 0 to $1 billion in 5 minutes, and they think that's how it's done. And after speaking to hundreds, if not thousands, of ultra high net worth families over the course of my career, I've developed a few rules of thumb. First, there's no magic age that you can tell your kids about the wealth or give your kids the wealth. Parents know their children. You know which ones can handle money well and which ones can't. But either way, by far and away, the number one tool that the ultra high net worth families tell me works is to insist that they have summer jobs or even after school jobs, because nothing is more sobering than a pay stub. In this case, withholding taxes are your friend. Remember that sticker shock the first time you saw how much of your salary goes for all those taxes that come out of a paycheck? Studies show that people who have worked are more likely to take better care of even inherited wealth. And so I have developed 3 keys to raising children in an atmosphere of wealth. My first key is start while young. I have a business friend who actually suggests that even the littlest toddlers can be taught that when they're done drinking out of their sippy cup, they're not to throw it on the floor, but instead they're to bring it over to the sink, even if the sink is way above their head because they're so little. Just teaching them that sense of responsibility in an age-appropriate way, that other people do not exist to wait on you, is an important and powerful lesson, even with the very young children. So that's my first key. My second key is to model your behavior, because unlike the old adage of do as I say, not as I do, your children are watching you. They are the students of your behavior, and they are learning your nonverbal cues even more strongly than they are paying attention to what you say. So make sure you model the behavior that you want them to emulate. And my final key is to find teachable moments. And they are everywhere, but they are often at the least opportune times. Sometimes it's when they're in the back seat and you're driving them to carpool or to an after-school activity. And other times, as I said, it's when you're online at the bank or the supermarket, when we're out of this quarantine, of course, and you're going to the bank or the supermarket, and your youngster asks you a potentially embarrassing question like, "Mommy, are we rich?" And how do you answer that question? And perhaps what you say is, "We're not going to discuss it online at the supermarket." But you shouldn't duck the question. You should answer it in an age-appropriate way and not say something like, "Well, yes, we're rich because we have our health," or "We're rich because we're a close and loving family." While those may be true, you should address them in an open, honest way and engage your child in an age-appropriate way. And those are my 3 keys to raising children in an atmosphere of wealth.
Well, thank you, Susan, for that. And, when you shared that with me the first time, this is something that my wife, Andrea, and I immediately implemented into how we speak to our children about wealth, how we work with them doing family chores and being able to take ownership as a family and doing it as a unit, and thinking through just our behaviors. And so that was so impactful for us. And one of the responses I heard back from some of our early listeners from one of the speaker series that you joined us for, was that earlier this year?
Mm-hmm. That was in March.
That was in March, just before.
It was the first week in March, right before the quarantine started. It feels like a year ago, Jonathan.
It
sure does.
It does. But some of the feedback I received was, Jonathan, the advice that she gave was great for those that have young kids, but I've got kids that are teenagers and young adults that are in the early 20s, and they know we have some wealth. They really don't know how much wealth, and how do I have that conversation with them, because I've never talked to them about money.
It is a scary thing to have those conversations, and the key is to do it in an age-appropriate way, again, and not duck the question. So a teenager or a young adult, you may not necessarily want to completely open the kimono and share the full family balance sheet, but your kids aren't dumb. They are living lives with open eyes, and they understand, they see how you live, and to pretend that the wealth doesn't exist does a disservice to them. One of the techniques, if philanthropy is part of your family culture, is to involve your children in your family philanthropy and share with them the asset management reports, the LionsGate reports, whether it's your monthly or quarterly reports of how your family foundation or your family donor advised fund is doing, and use that as an opportunity to teach them the basics of how do you meet with your financial manager? What are the basics of asset allocation? What are the basic concepts of financial literacy in a way that is less threatening than perhaps sharing with them your full family balance sheet? So there are certainly ways to do that. If there's a family office, you can invite them to perhaps intern over the summer at the family office and learn some things. You can share with them the family story of how the wealth was created. There are many different ways at age-appropriate times to start communicating with your children so that it's not this deep, dark black hole that everyone's afraid to acknowledge exists.
And, relative to that, you told us, and we certainly believe you, that communicating is the linchpin to being able to address family wealth and communicate. But in your experience, oftentimes there are elephants in the room, or there's a big elephant in the room. And even though families are trying to make an effort to communicate well, sometimes that one big elephant isn't discussed or it's avoided altogether. In your experience, Susan, what are one of those big elephants in the room that families tend to avoid talking about?
Well, it is scary, Mark, to have that money talk with your kids. I often say that the dreaded money talk is even scarier for parents than that dreaded sex talk. But parents who say to me that their children have no idea that their family is wealthy are just fooling themselves. The money is the elephant in the room. There's this wonderful thing out there called the internet. Maybe you've heard of it. Kids Google their parents. These kids Zillow their house to see what it's worth. They see how you live. They see how you travel. And the kids at school talk. And so on the playground, one playmate may say to your child, your family's rich, even if somehow you've managed to avoid that. And even if you've managed to avoid all of that, at Thanksgiving dinner, when the parents are all sitting and chatting over coffee and dessert when the kids are all upstairs talking with their cousins, well, if your brother-in-law has told his kids about your family's wealth, guess what? Now your kids know. Mm-hmm. I once sat in the elegant library of a mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, where a lot of the hedge fund and private equity millionaires and billionaires live. And the man who owned the house told me that his children had no idea that the family was wealthy. So it is just astonishing to me that that parents think that they can pretend that the wealth doesn't exist, and it really goes back to the question earlier about raising teenagers and young adults and addressing the issue, of course, in an age-appropriate way, but also not denying the wealth and using it as a teaching opportunity. My favorite quote about communication is from George Bernard Shaw, who said the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. And that really speaks to me because so often people think they have communicated something they haven't. And as I've mentioned, nonverbal cues are one way that we communicate without realizing it. But there are other ways in which we think that we've communicated, or sometimes we think it is so implicit and clear that it doesn't need to be verbalized. But instead, that failure to speak does cause a mountain of pain. And I'd like to share a story about two sisters.
Let's do it.
Okay, so I want to share a story about two sisters and what happened with a failure to communicate. So growing up, these two sisters who grew up in, the 30s or 40s, and they were very close as children. And sadly, one of the sisters was plagued by a lifetime of illness, and she was just one of those sad, unhappy people even into her adult years. But her other sister grew up to become financially successful, and she married a man who was even more financially successful, and she had 2 children, and really lived that perfect, charmed life. And the 2 sisters were, they kept in touch, but they grew apart. And ultimately what happened was, when their parents died, they left all of their wealth to the sister who had been struggling, the one who could never really work because of her illness, who was struggling financially, struggling socially, and was truly just an unhappy person. And they never sat the wealthy sister, we'll call her the wealthy sister, down. We'll use their names. So Jenny was the one who was the financially successful sister, and Sally was the one who was the one who was struggling. And so the parents left all of their wealth to Sally because they felt that she really needed it and Jenny didn't. But they never sat Jenny down and told her why they had done what they did, what their thinking was. And presumably they thought it was very clear and it was implicit that Sally needed it more than Jenny did. Mm-hmm. But ultimately what happened was Jenny was left with this sense of, my parents didn't love me. My parents didn't trust me. They never even gave me the opportunity to receive sentimental items that didn't have any or much nominal value. And I was just completely cut out of my parents' estate. And it caused a horrible rift between the sisters. And the sisters never spoke again. And to make a really sad story even worse, about a year later, Sally eventually succumbed to her lifelong illnesses, and she too passed away. And because of the rift that was created between herself and her sister, she ended up leaving her wealth that she had inherited from her parents to a distant cousin instead of to her sister Jenny or even to her sister Jenny's children. And so poor Jenny was left with this horrible sense of, not only did my parents not love me and trust me, but I lost my opportunity to ever reconnect with my sister. And I've watched my parents' wealth that I watched them scrimp and save and work hard over the course of their lives. I've watched that wealth now go outside the family to this distant cousin instead of to me or to my children. So that's really why it's so important to have these family conversations, even when it's so difficult. And so my message from that story is that bequests are messages from those no longer with us after they're gone. So be sure that you send the message that you intend.
Well, that's such a powerful story, and thank you for sharing that, Susan. When I think of passing on an estate from one generation to the next, oftentimes you don't think of that scenario of what would happen just in conversation with your own family, unless you've been led by an advisor that's helping you think that way. So in determining how an estate passes on to the next generation, I know that there can be debate as to what constitutes an equal distribution versus equitable distribution. And could you elaborate a little bit more on that for us? Because in this case, I think there's a number of ways in your story that you just shared that could have been expressed prior to your parents passing away, and then facilitated in communication between the generations and the intent.
Sure. Well, in the debate of what constitutes equal versus equitable, my main point is that fair doesn't always mean equal, and equal doesn't always mean equitable. And so parents tend to give to their children based on need, and during their lifetimes, I think that's completely appropriate. So if you've got one child who attends junior college and another goes to med school, well, med school is going to be a lot more expensive, so that child is going to receive a larger proportion of the family's educational dollars. If one child lives in a city where, like New York City, where I live, where the lifestyle is very expensive, and another child lives in small town USA with a lower standard of living, where a home costs less and the grocery store costs less, then you might want to be unequal so that the child who has a more expensive lifestyle receives a larger portion. Or maybe you don't. Or if one child becomes a member of the clergy or an inner school teacher or a nonprofit employee, and the other child becomes a celebrity or a famous sports figure, then that child probably doesn't need their parents' help in order to pay their monthly bills. And in fact, they're probably doing their own creditor protection planning, and the last thing that they want is money from their parents. So you take all of those different things into account. But what I caution families all the time is to avoid that scenario where your children eventually say to one another, "Mom and Dad loved you better," which of course every sibling has said at least once. And there's another way to look at the equal versus equitable debate, which is at a generational level. So consider this example. You've got a client family that has mom and dad and 2 children, and the parents say they want to treat each child equally, and that's easy. They just split their estate 50-50, or they create equal trusts for their children 50-50. But what happens at the next generation when the son has 3 children and the daughter has 1 child? What do the grandparents do? Do they say, I have 4 grandchildren, so each grandchild receives 25% of my estate? Is that fair? Well, many people would say yes, and my answer is maybe. Or do they say, well, I have 2 branches of children, and so my son's branch of 3 children will split his 50%, and my daughter's branch of 1 child will get her whole 50%. Is that fair or fairer? And the answer is maybe. Because ultimately, neither answer is necessarily bad. It's just a necessary result of leaving money equally to your children at death. There is no right answer. The only right answer is to ask the question so that you or your client family can decide for yourself. And I guarantee that 9 out of 10 lawyers, if not 10 out of 10 lawyers, never discuss this with their clients. It's baked right into the boilerplate of their documents.
Boy, there's so much richness here, and I wish we could spend more time. Susan, we're coming to the end of our time, and so we always like to ask this question of our podcast guests, and that is, if you could leave our listeners with just one thing to remember about today's podcast, what would that be? Well, we all know the 3 rules of real estate, right? Location, location, location. Well, my top 3 rules for effective family dynamics and governance are communication, communication, communication. Remember that story of the 2 sisters? Well, I'll let you in on a little secret. That sister Jenny, who was the more well-off sister, Jenny was my mother. It's all a true story, and when it happened, it affected me very deeply. And that's why I'm so passionate about family communication, and that's why I'm speaking with you about it today. It shows you that even sad stories can have positive outcomes. And my outcome is the privilege to share my mother's story with you and your listeners, and hopefully have all of you thinking about these things in a whole different way than perhaps you had been, with some tools and techniques to get you started. As we've discussed, it's not always easy and sometimes can be downright scary for parents to talk about the wealth with their kids. But if you don't, there can be unintended and sometimes tragic consequences. And that's why family meetings are frequently facilitated by an outside third party, whether me or someone like me, because it provides a neutralizing force to keep everyone out of the negative sandbox behavior that caused the family disharmony in the first place.
Well, Susan, thank you for that, and thank you for opening up and being vulnerable with us to share with us your own story about your family. I know I've had similar stories that we've heard from other clients, as well as my own with my own grandparents, similar in nature, but between siblings, which would have included my dad and aunt and uncle. And if folks want to get more information about these and other great resources that you have available to help facilitate those conversations and engage you, how would they be able to best do that?
Well, thank you for asking about that. I have 2 different websites that they can visit. For my consulting work with families, the website is www.wlallc.com, as in Wealth Legacy Advisors, LLC.com. So again, WLALLC.com. And my speaking website, should anyone want to engage me for public speaking, is www.susanschoenfeld.com. So SusanSchoenfeld.com.
Thank you for that, Susan. That's great. And I hope that some of our listeners will follow up with you, because we know some of these issues are paramount with them. And so in closing, we call this podcast Living a Richer Life by Design. And when I say those words to you, what meaning does it have for you?
Well, Jonathan, Mark, I just love that this is the title of your podcast. To me, it means being intentional about what for many people is mere happenstance. So many people follow whatever trail of breadcrumbs that life sets out for us without having a clear path in mind. Or maybe they start out with a clear path, and then they take twists and turns and sidetracks when opportunities present themselves. But to me, living a richer life by design implies living with intention, creating your own circumstance to the extent it's in your power to do so, and making the choices that further your goals to enrich your life personally, emotionally, and intentionally.
Susan, I love how articulate you are, and what a wonderful response. So thank you for encouraging us with our pursuit of living a richer life by design today. And for each of our listeners, we hope you enjoyed today's show. At LionsGate Advisors, we believe a truly rich life entails much more than just financial prosperity. It means crafting a life with purpose and intention, just as Susan had shared with you. So the question we'd like to leave you with is, what can you do today to live a richer life by design tomorrow? Thank you again for listening, and be sure to subscribe to Living a Richer Life by Design to receive an update when a new episode is published. If you enjoyed our podcast today, please consider leaving a written review or a star rating by clicking the podcast tile artwork in iTunes or your podcast app. You can learn more about LionsGate Advisors by visiting us online at LionsGateAdvisors.com and LionsGateAdvisors.com/podcast to listen to other episodes and other interviews that we've had. And again, we want to thank you, Susan Schoenfeld, for joining us today and for being our guest on today's show, and all the very best to you and your family.
Thank you so much for having me. It was my pleasure.
We hope you enjoyed today's show. At LionsGate Advisors, we believe a truly rich life entails much more than financial prosperity. It means crafting a life with purpose and intention. So thank you for listening, and be sure to subscribe to Living a Richer Life by Design to receive an update when a new episode is published. If you enjoy our podcast, please consider leaving a written review or star rating by clicking the podcast tile artwork in iTunes. You can learn more about LionsGate Advisors by visiting us online at LionsGateAdvisors.com and LionsGateAdvisors.com/podcasts.